minds
So
are
do you
built
see
a
the
little different.
supernatural at work as you look out across what's happening in the world now? Do you see God at work? Do you ever think to yourself, these are forces that are not human?
I woke up this morning to discover this interview has now been posted 2 hours and 7 minutes. It's a fascinating interview. I watched the first hour, went to town, did some street work, returned to watch the second and final parts, and I strongly encourage all people to sit down and watch this particular interview. It is historical after all, and credit to Carlson for flying to Russia to conduct such an interview. No other Western journalist has had the guts to do this. But before we get into the video at hand, I see that Carlson is sporting what looks like a Kabbalah wristband, possibly, or am I imagining it? This is a very long 2 hour and 7 minute interview, and I won't go through all of it, well, of course not, but a couple of sections I thought were worthy of dipping into and responding to some of the things that Putin says. I've never seen a Western politician be so candid on camera for such a prolonged period of time. This is a good opportunity for Putin to address the world, put his side of things out there. I think he made one mistake, however. He didn't speak in English whatsoever, and he can speak English. The French president, Mr. Macron, speaks very good English, and I think that's to his credit. When he addresses the world's media, he speaks in the language of the last days, English, whereas Putin chose not to do so.
Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
This goes back to the Nord pipeline that was blowing up. Very interesting what he says in response to such a question.
You know, I won't get into details, but people always say in such cases, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we should not only look for someone who is interested, but also for someone who has capabilities. Because there may be many people interested, but not all of them are capable of sinking to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected. Who is interested and who is capable of doing it?
But I'm confused. I mean, that's the biggest act of industrial terrorism ever, and it's the largest emission of CO2 in history. Okay, so if you had evidence, and presumably given your security services, your intel services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West, did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
I'm more interested in the answer than the question. That's why I want to just highlight this clip and then comment shortly.
In the war of propaganda, it is very difficult to defeat the United States, because the United States controls all the world's media and many European media. The ultimate beneficiary of the biggest European media are American financial institutions. Don't you know that?
Like Fox News, where Tucker was one of the main anchors for a long time, working for Rupert Murdoch, who is and was a very strong proponent of Roman Catholicism and was a good friend of, I think, John Paul II, and a generous donor to the Schuller dynasty also.
So it is possible to get involved in this work, but it is cost prohibitive, so to speak. We can simply shine the spotlight on our sources of information, and we will not achieve results. It is clear to the whole world what happened, and even American analysts talk about it directly.
It's kind of rich, really, because the former Soviet Union were past masters at propaganda, plotting and planning, and propelling their propaganda machine all over the world. The reason why I wanted to just highlight this section is because the CIA, that is the department he's referring to indirectly, was once called the Catholic Intelligence Agency. Not the Central Intelligence Agency, but the Catholic Intelligence Agency. And the founder of the CIA was a guy called Donovan, who was a papal knight, a very powerful Roman Catholic. And of course you need to study the Jesuits to really understand how the CIA has been able to benefit them over the years, because of course the Catholic Church has the greatest spy network in the entire world. In fact, May of 2023, Zelensky went to Rome, and whilst Zelensky was in Rome to meet the Pope, he also met the head of MI6. Very interesting. I think only one or two news outlets actually reported such a meeting. Why are the Jesuits meeting with Zelensky? And why is the head of MI6 meeting him at the Vatican, of all places?
It's true.
Yes, but here's a question you may be able to answer. You worked in Germany, famously. The Germans clearly know that their NATO partner did this, and it damaged their economy greatly. It may never recover. Why are they being silent about it? That's very confusing to me. Why wouldn't the Germans say something about it?
Because they're bought, of course, by Big Pharma, Lockheed Martin, British Aerospace, other groups and enterprises. It's a somewhat redundant question, but of course it has to be put to Putin to respond. Why aren't the Germans standing up for themselves? Let's jump into 141 minutes. And a lot of this, of course, is geopolitics. And Putin spent the first 40 minutes laying the foundation for his presentation. And as a student of history myself, I thought it was very interesting what he had to say. He made the argument that Poland and Hungary have a claim also to Ukraine, apparently, which is interesting. But let's jump into 1 hour and 41 minutes.
Camilla put it. We could have stopped those hostilities with war a year and a half ago already. But the British persuaded us and we refused this. Where is Mr. Johnson now? And the war continues.
Yes, Boris Johnson, very much a hawk, wanted to keep this war going, as has his successor, Mr. Sunak. And you would have thought, as a democracy, we would have had a say in this particular war. We are paying for it after all as British taxpayers. But this goes back to geopolitics. This goes back to the 1% ruling the entire world. And of course Putin is a very wealthy man himself, as is Mr. Zelensky and his wife in Kiev, of course.
That's a good question. Where do you think he is, and why did he do that?
Hell knows. I don't understand it myself.
Of course he understands it. Of course he does. They get kickbacks. Every politician gets kickbacks. Town Hall has always been corrupt. He knows perfectly well why this war has been allowed to continue with the destruction of almost 1 million people on both sides. It's just criminal. But the reason why I wanted to make this video is because we have quite a strong possibility in the UK and elsewhere of conscription returning for the first time since, I think, 1962, 63. And just last week, the government of Latvia ordered all men between the ages of 18 to 28 to sign up for compulsory conscription. And the head of the British Army has also called for the same. And one former Foreign Secretary by the name of William Hague has gone on record to suggest that a figure of around 800,000 men and also women is a plausible number to find to fight Russia in Ukraine in the not too far future. Incredible times.
There was a general starting point. For some reason, everyone had the illusion that Russia could be defeated on the battlefield. Because of arrogance, because of a pure heart, but not because of a great mind.
This goes back to the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, and also Libya. Disastrous wars. And of course the West can no longer win any wars. And the arrogance that Ukraine, with the help of NATO, could beat Russia has also been proven to be incorrect. This is a delusion that we now are experiencing due to the world having no statesmen, just puppet politicians, empty vessels led by the devil, of course.
You've described the connection between Russia and Ukraine. You've described Russia itself a couple of times as orthodox. That's central to your understanding of Russia. You said you're orthodox. What does that mean for you? You're a Christian leader by your own description. So what effect does that have on you?
He's not a Christian. He's a career politician. He's a very shrewd and menacing politician. When he was in the KGB for many years, he would torture people, and he had the idea of using Alsatian dogs to mount pregnant Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, just this morning I was speaking to a guy in town, a former Jehovah's Witness, who told me that just week before last, the Russian government had proscribed the Jehovah's Witnesses. I was quite shocked, and have closed all of their places of worship down and confiscated their own properties. This, of course, is a throwback to the bad old days, the USSR, communism, atheism, Darwinism, and of course, for a long time, the USSR were the #1 sponsors of promoting Darwinism in schools, colleges, and universities all over the world. Now, sadly, we, as a Western nation, a fallen nation, are now exporting such nonsense to other parts of the world.
You know, as I already mentioned, in 988, Prince Vladimir himself was baptized following the example of his grandmother, Princess Olga. And then he baptized his squad, and then gradually, over the course of several years, he baptized all the Rus. It was a lengthy process, from pagans to Christians. It took many years. But in the end, this orthodoxy, Eastern Christianity, deeply rooted itself in the consciousness of the Russian people.
Which is true, until Stalin banned it. But of course the problem with the Orthodox churches is that they baptize babies. Many other problems, of course, but they baptize babies. They hold to what's called baptismal regeneration, which is a heresy. And this guy was baptized as a baby. He thinks that has made him a Christian. Well, of course it does not. This is the problem when you get into organized religion.
When Russia expanded and absorbed other nations who profess Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, Russia has always been very loyal to those people who profess other religions. This is her strength.
Not true. Go back to Chechnya. Go back to Christians during the Soviet Union, tortured, murdered for confessing faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. In fact, the Soviet Union was far worse than the Nazis. I think Hitler had around 50 concentration camps throughout Europe. The Soviets had over 200. And of course it lasted from 1922, 23, right the way through to 1989. It was hell for millions upon millions of people. Eastern Europe, the entire country of Russia, of course. And incredibly enough, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the wall came down, nobody voted for a communist to stand for office. They've always gone for someone like him, Putin, who of course is a dictator. He's been in office for, 24 years? He's been able to rewrite the constitution many times. But of course every country needs their own identity. If you throw out atheism, which he would say they did in the late 1980s, early 1990s, you've got to replace it with something else. Incidentally, 40% of the Russian army are Muslim. So of course for Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky, they've had to fall back onto the Orthodox Church, which of course predates them by many hundreds of years.
This is absolutely clear. And the fact is that the main postulates, main values are very similar, not to say the same, in all world religions I've just mentioned, and which are the traditional religions of the Russian Federation, Russia. By the way, Russian authorities were always very careful about the culture and religion of those people who came into the Russian Empire. This, in my opinion, forms the basis of both security and stability of the Russian statehood.
Just for the record, the original leaders of the Soviet Union, from Lenin to Trotsky, were all secular Jews, and Stalin was trained at a Jesuit school. So you've got a real mishmash of people governing the country for such a long time. No real accountability. If you think about China today, you've got about 200 people governing just under 2 billion people. And in Russia, not quite the same as the Soviet Union, but someone like Putin is very close to the Orthodox Church in Russia, which of course goes against 2 Corinthians chapter 6, separation. But due to the state being so powerful in Russia, and the church as well, what do they say? You scratch my back, I will scratch yours. They're both very much in bed together. This is very much a spiritual war, and it's kind of ironic that this interview has been found on X, formerly known as Twitter, and of course X marks the spot, 666.
All the peoples inhabiting Russia basically consider it their motherhood. If, say, people move over to you or to Europe from Latin America, an even clearer and more understandable example, people come, but yet they have come to you or to European countries from their historical homeland. And people who profess different religions in Russia consider Russia their motherland. They have no other motherland.
But your freedom of speech is heavily limited. You can't street preach on the streets of Russia. So someone like myself would be probably arrested very quickly, detained, and possibly either imprisoned or deported for street preaching.
We are together. This is one big family, and our traditional values are very similar. I've just mentioned one big family, but everyone has his, her own family. And this is the basis of our society. And if we say that the motherland and the family are specifically connected with each other, it is indeed the case, since it is impossible to ensure a normal future for our children and our families unless we ensure a normal, sustainable future for the entire country.
I think one thing I will say in defense of Putin is he is pro the family. Well, that's kind of ironic. He's got several love children, but he is pro the family. He stood against the transgender madness. I'm not sure what his views are specifically on LGBTQ. I've heard some proponents of homosexuality saying that Russia is okay with that. Who knows if that is true or not, but it's like Israel, unfortunately very pro the LGBTQ community. And also, somewhat interestingly, is how Zelensky, Jewish by birth, is backing Hamas, who of course attacked Israel on the 7th of October. Again, geopolitics is a very murky, mysterious, and devilish world to really get involved in.
But can I say that the one way in which the religions are different is that Christianity is specifically a nonviolent religion. Jesus says, turn the other cheek, don't kill. How can a leader who has to kill, of any country, how can a leader be a Christian? How do you reconcile that to yourself?
What a juvenile question. As a government, any government for that matter, they have the right to take life. Romans 13 makes that very clear. But of course, in Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7 and 8, you have the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus is speaking to individuals that are being persecuted for being Christians. They are to turn the other cheek. But of course, never the state. If you turn the other cheek, you'll be invaded within minutes.
It is very easy when it comes to protecting oneself and one's family, one's homeland. We won't attack anyone. When did the developments in Ukraine start? Since the coup d'etat and the hostilities in Donbass began, that's when they started.
This goes back to when Obama was running for the presidency. He mocked turn the other cheek from the Gospel of Matthew. Thought it was hilarious to use such an account, and said, how could a government defend themselves? Talk about a straw man. Talk about a fallacy. I don't know if Tucker really does want to know the answer to such a question, or if he's just trying to find a way to get behind the man Putin. For the record, Tucker is an Episcopal Christian, quote unquote. He's a liberal, not a Bible believer. But to be fair to him, he's gone to Russia to conduct this interview. A lot of pushback in the US for this interview going out. But we, as the world, have a right to hear both sides of the story. Because, of course, if conscription is reintroduced to the UK, Europe, Australasia, North America, it'll be your boys and girls going to fight and get injured and perhaps even die in a proxy war, which really only benefits Big Pharma, Lockheed Martin, British Aerospace, and other multi-trillion-dollar enterprises. And that's why this war is continuing to go on. Of course, politicians are getting generous kickbacks to continue this war, which of course cannot be won. You can't win this war. It's a civil war.
And we're protecting our people, ourselves, our homeland, and our future. As for religion in general, you know, it's not about external manifestations. It's not about going to church every day or banging your head on the floor. It is in the heart. And our culture is so human-oriented.
That's true, but of course his church would not believe in that. His church would not agree with that. His church would be very against people staying at home, doing their own thing, having their own private Bible studies. They would expect them to go to the local churches and be part of the system. But of course Putin wants to offer himself as a cool guy, easygoing sort of a guy, a non-totalitarian, when in reality freedom of speech has long gone in Russia, whereas in the UK it's not far behind Russia, ironically.
Dostoevsky, who was very well known in the West and the genius of Russian culture, Russian literature, spoke a lot about this, about the Russian soul.
Русский человек, российский человек, он думает больше о вечном, думает больше о ценностях.
After all, Western society is more pragmatic. Russian people think more about the eternal, about moral values. I don't know, maybe you won't agree with me, but Western culture is more pragmatic after all.
Yes, that's true, but also the Russian people, for the most part, are superstitious, not particularly religious. There's a high dependency on alcoholism, and a lot of people struggle terribly in Russia. The death rate is pretty high, and the life expectancy, I think, is quite low. So again, you're getting a very mixed message here. For Putin, this is his chance to have his say, and for Tucker, this gives him a level of authority. You say, you know, I've been able to break out from Fox News, do my own thing, and I'm the one only journalist to get the big scoop of the, quite honestly, for the decade or two. This is such an interesting interview, it really is. Like or loathe Putin, what he says is fascinating to listen to. And I think people should watch this because, again, it'll be your sons, your daughters going to fight and perhaps even die in a country thousands of miles away and not even realizing what this is all about. Just think back to the Gulf War I and Gulf War II. Think back to Libya, think back to Afghanistan, all those campaigns we've been involved in for the last, 25, 30 years or so. They've all ended in disaster. It's so easy to start a war, but it's so difficult to finish it. And after you do finish the war, what was it all for? The bad guys become the good guys, and the good guys become the bad guys. For now, Putin is the boogeyman, and that's really been to the benefit of the West to bang the war drum and to terrorize people, terrify people, and force people to submit really to this desperate call for conscription to return. But of course, the politicians won't be sending their sons and daughters to fight. They'll be sending your sons and daughters to fight. It's a bit like Yasser Arafat, always calling for jihad, 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 but he didn't send his own two sons to fight. Israel, his two sons were very comfortable living in France with their Catholic mother.
Возможность вот сегодняшнему этому золотому миллиарду.
I'm not saying this is bad. It makes it possible for today's golden billion to achieve good success in production, even in science and so on.
Что мы вроде как выглядим одинаково, но
There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that we kind of look the same, but our
So,
minds
so
are
do you
built a
see
little
the
different.
supernatural at work as you look out across what's happening in the world now? Do you see God at work? Do you ever think to yourself, these are forces that are not human?
This is a great picture also of Armageddon, when all of the nations come together under the leadership of the devil to go into Israel, and of course the Lord steps in and just wipes them all out. So Putin's a very superstitious man, but he's more of a pragmatist than a preacher. Religious, yeah, quite likely. Zelensky, as far as I can tell, is a secular Jew, but for Putin, he's a religious Gentile, superstitious. He plays the church as and when he needs to, and of course they dance to his tune, Putin's tune, because of course he's the president. He has the power, he has the money, so on and so forth.
Да нет, я, честно говоря, так не думаю. Я думаю о том, что
No, to be honest, I don't think so.
развивается вот по своим внутренним.
My opinion is that the development of the world community is in accordance with the inherent laws, and those laws are what they are.
Так было всегда в истории человечества.
It's always been this way in the history of mankind. Some nations and countries rose, became stronger and more numerous, and then left the international stage, losing the status they had accustomed to.
This is somewhat of a throwback to his KGB days, when he was working for an atheist country, and the mere thoughts of mentioning Christianity was an anathema. So he wants to appear as somewhat of a libertarian, perhaps, not too religious. Is it supernatural? No, I don't think so, he says. And yet at the same time he's very religious. He has to be. And so too was Stalin during World War II. Before the Germans arrived in Russia, most of the bishops were in prison. And once the war began, and it looked like Russia was going to lose, they were quickly released from prison to rally the people. This is where you're going to watch politicians. They play the church very, very well, especially in the US. And of course, once you get into office, the talk of religion goes out the window. And people have very short memories as well.
There's probably no need for me to give examples, but we could start with the Genghis Khan and horde conquerors, the Golden Horde, and then end with the Roman Empire.
Also, the religious card is beneficial to someone like Putin, because of course in America all the politicians are religious. The Middle East are all religious, so it puts him in a camp of being religious. But in his heart, I think he probably believes in himself, like 99.9% of politicians around the world do. But he can't say that because he wants the church, being the Orthodox Church, to back him up. And he may want allies also in Christendom around the world to back him up. Because again, he needs a foundation. He needs more than just a philosophy to fall back on. He needs something substantial. And of course you get that from religion.
It seems that there has never been anything like the Roman Empire in the history of mankind. Nevertheless, the potential of the barbarians gradually grew, as did their population. In general, the barbarians were getting stronger and begun to develop economically, as we would say today. This eventually led to the collapse of the Roman Empire and the regime imposed by the Romans. However, it took 5 centuries for the Roman Empire to fall apart. The difference with what is happening now is that all the processes of change are happening at a much faster pace than in Roman times.
Because we're coming to the end of the church age, which his bishops won't tell him because they don't want to think that Christ is going to come back. They are post-millennial, basically. They believe that they will make this world a better place and then Christ will come back. But the Word of God says, no, things get worse, a whole lot worse, and then the Lord comes back for the rapture, first of all. You've got the Great Tribulation, and of course the 1,000-year reign. What you're seeing here is a build-up to Armageddon, or a dummy run for Armageddon to prepare people to fight. Think back to 2019, 2020, a whole year of lockdown, mandates, the shots, so on and so forth, and they used the intelligence agencies around the world to terrorize and traumatize people. And in the UK, Brigade 77 were mobilized to use propaganda war and psyops to deceive people, to terrify people into following the orders of the state. And here we are, 3-4 years later, same sort of a thing. Quick, we need a big army, 1 million man strong, to go and fight the Russians thousands of miles away. And the Americans and the Australasians and the Europeans all marching to the drum beats of war. Sweden also massively mobilizing their forces. Poland wanting to have a huge land army to propel Russian aggression. But I just want people to think very carefully before they allow their own children to potentially sign up, volunteer, or be forced to fight in a war which is really about money. It's about power, prestige, who can come out on top. And again, just go back to Gulf War I, Gulf War II, all the Islamic wars. What were they all for? What was achieved? You go to Afghanistan today, they still teach Sharia law there. Children are still kept out of the schools. Women are still burqa'd up. And Iraq, run by tribal warlords. And Libya, such a state of a country now. And even Trump rightly says, what was it all for? I mean, the Americans lost so much money and they spent so much money and lost so many people, so many soldiers died and suffered terribly in Iraq. And I've met British troops on the streets in the UK. Many are very bitter they've left the forces, and they ask me sometimes, what was it all for? How do you respond to that question? What was it all for?
So when does the AI empire start, do you think?
Меня всё
We're
сложные
asking
вопросы.
increasingly more complicated questions. To answer them, you need to be an expert in big
Для того,
numbers,
чтобы
big
ответить
data,
надо быть,
and
конечно,
AI.
специалистом в
Mankind is
сфере
currently
чисел,
facing many threats.
в сфере
Due to the genetic researches, it is now possible to create a superhuman, a specialized human being, a genetically engineered athlete, scientist, military man. There are reports that Elon Musk had already had a chip implanted in the human brain in the USA.
The Word of God said in the last days that men would catch up basically and become more mindful as to how the world works and be more wise, as it were, and yet very ignorant as to the reason for that. That, of course, is the Lord allowing man more information to really use against man as a form of self-destruction. I don't think Putin has ever really read the Bible all the way through. I doubt Carlson has as well. So you've got two lost men, incredibly wealthy, discussing pretty serious subjects as well. I will say that. And yet, unfortunately, all these people are humanists at heart. They want their best life now, as Joel Osteen would say.
чип в мозг какого-то человека.
What do you think of that?
Ну, Маска, я думаю, что Маска остановить
Well,
невозможно.
I think there's no stopping Elon Musk. He will do as he sees fit.
Надо искать
Nevertheless,
способы
you need to find some common ground with him, search for ways to persuade him. I think he's a smart person, I truly believe he is.
нужно
So you need to reach an agreement with
Same hand mannerisms as Trump, interestingly.
him because this process needs to be formalized and subjected to certain rules.
того, что будет происходить с ним в связи с развитием вот этих новейших исследований и технологий в генетике. либо
Humanity has to consider what is going to happen due to the newest development in genetics
Поэтому
or in AI.
вот
One can make an approximate prediction of what will happen.
угрозу своему существованию от ядерного оружия, все начали обладатели ядерного
Once
оружия, начали
mankind
между собой
felt an
договариваться.
existential threat coming from nuclear weapons,
Неаккуратное применение
all nuclear nations began to come to terms with one another since they realized the negligent use of nuclear weaponry could drive humanity to extinction.
And they will be used, incidentally, according to the book of Zechariah, which again Putin doesn't know or doesn't care to share, and I wouldn't have thought that Carlson knows much about this either. This is why it's so important to find people who actually know God, fear God, and will take about the Lord in the Word of God.
интеллекта, либо генетики, либо еще каких-то современных направлений, остановить которые невозможно.
It is impossible to stop research in genetics or AI today, just as it was impossible to stop the use of gunpowder back in the day.
Once you open Pandora's box, that's it. Once they decided to clone sheep and do IVF and stuff such as that, you can't go back. Once you give people colour television, you can't go back to black and white. Once you give people 24-hour rolling news, you can't go back to 2 or 3 news bulletins a day. Once you give people freedom, you can't go back to how it used to be beforehand. We've got so much, and yet we've got so little. We are bankrupt as a people right at the end of the church age.
There is an ongoing dialogue between the special services. This has to be resolved in a calm, responsible, and professional manner.
He means FSB, MI6, Mossad, CIA, the Jesuits especially, and other secret services around the world. And yes, it's true, they all speak to one another. The back channels are always open. Mossad speaks to Hamas, Hamas speak to Mossad. Every country has to speak to one another to keep channels open. And of course for the spies around the world, for them this is just another day at the office.
They're keeping in touch, so let them do their work. I do not rule out that the person you refer to, Mr. Gershkovitz, may return to his motherland. By the end of the day, it does not make any sense to keep him in prison in Russia. We want the U.S. Special Services to think about how they can contribute to achieving the goals our special services are pursuing.
This is called a bargaining chip. I think an American journalist was arrested for spying. Every country spies on one another. British and American planes fly over Russia, vice versa. Every country has to speak to one another to keep channels open. And of course for the spies around the world, for them this is just another day at the office. Allied ships go through Russian waters, vice versa. And the same would be true of the Chinese, the Japanese, the North Koreans. Again, this is geopolitics. This is nothing new, of course. But again, the reason why I'm making this recording is because it's quite possible, if not quite plausible, if not quite probable, that in the next 6 to 12 months we could see mass mobilization, conscription globally. And because most people don't know what's going on in the world, they'll be compelled into a war zone to fight an unwinnable war, which only really benefits the 1% govern the entire world.
But are you worried that what's happening in Ukraine could lead to something much larger and much more horrible? And how motivated are you just to call the U.S. government and say, let's come to terms?
It's gone past that. Once you start a war like this, it's almost impossible to fix it, unless, of course, the Antichrist arrives and he bangs heads together and they see him as a great saviour of the world. But at the moment, the Russians are digging their heels in, and the Ukrainians just simply cannot win. Russia's too powerful. And all of your proxy forces and mercenaries fighting an illegal war, I might also add, and if those soldiers were ever arrested and put before the Hague, they could be sent to prison for a long period of time. And of course, the governments that send them would wash their hands of these people. That's why you need to know who the enemy is. And the truth of the matter is, the enemy is not necessarily without, but I would say within. So many problems in the world today, but again, for governments, they want to distract, deflect, and get people's eyes on a very far away country, a very complicated situation, which you can't understand, so just trust us to think it for you, or think it through for you and explain it to you. And of course, once governments do that, as we know from just 3 years ago, people start to fall in line very, very quickly.
I already said that we did not refuse to talk. We're willing to negotiate. It is the Western side, and Ukraine is obviously a satellite state of the US. It is evident. I do not want you to take it as if I'm looking for a strong word or an insult, but we both understand what is happening. The financial support, $72 billion was provided. Germany ranks second, then other European countries come. Dozens of billions of US dollars are going to Ukraine.
Taxpayers, nobody asked about it. Soldiers being sent to fight and die in a faraway nation. This is God's judgment on sin, you see. Hell is God's judgment on sin hereafter, but war is God's judgment on sin here. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing very powerful people using ordinary people to fight a proxy war, which really only benefits a handful of people. Zelensky, a very wealthy man, as is his wife. Putin, a very wealthy man. And the Bidens, well, of course, we all know about the Bidens, very corrupt, and other world leaders getting very generous kickbacks. And yes, I am cynical. I've been alive long enough to be cynical. But as a Christian, I have compassion on people who perhaps aren't aware of all the information, and you owe it to yourself to check out what's going on in case you get a phone call or a letter in the post over the next 6 to 12 months ordering you to report to your local army station to begin drills and basic fitness, so on and so forth. Just for the record, I love my country, and I would stand up for my country if necessary. And if I thought my country was under threat, and of course I would do the right thing, as I'm sure most people would. I'm not a pacifist, and I hope you wouldn't be either. Without men and women to fight for one's country, you'd have bullies just taking over the neighbourhood and dominating all of us. So we all need strong governments, strong armies, and I've been calling for decades for the British military system to be quadrupled, quite simply. But this Russia-Ukraine thing, civil war, it goes back to the 8th century according to Putin's presentation, and earlier on he spoke about wanting to join NATO twice and was initially told he could, only to later be told he could not, and wanting to work with the EU and the US on some military infrastructure, some protection system like the Iron Dome, missile defense system he called it. That was also rebuffed. So again, geopolitics, and civilians, we have very little knowledge about all of this. And again, without conscription being thrown into the mix, I wouldn't be discussing this subject whatsoever. But because I think it's relevant to all of us, we have a duty to warn other people.
There's a huge influx of weapons. In this case, you should tell the current Ukrainian leadership to stop and come to a negotiating table, rescind this absurd decree. We did not refuse.
Sure, but you already said it. I didn't think you meant it as an insult, because you already said correctly, it's been reported that Ukraine was prevented from negotiating a peace settlement by the former British Prime Minister acting on behalf of the Biden administration. So of course they're a satellite. Big countries control small countries. That's not new.
It's also interesting that a lot of people in Poland are fed up with the mass migration of Ukrainians into their country. They've been overwhelmed by the Ukrainians fleeing into Poland, and you would have thought that such people would stay put and fight for their country. In fact, here's a quick thought for you. If the British Army are looking for manpower, why not second all of these people that come over in the boats every day from Paris or France, Calais, Boulogne to be more precise? Why not commandeer those people, second those people into the British Army? 150,000, almost 200,000 have come over in the last 3 to 4 years. But of course they won't do that. They'll take your sons and your daughters, your grandsons, your granddaughters, and sacrifice your sons and your daughters, your grandsons and your granddaughters on the altar of profits, of course.
Well, if the Zelensky administration in Ukraine refused to negotiate, I assume they did it under the instruction from Washington. If Washington believes it to be the wrong decision, let it abandon it. Let it find a delicate excuse so that no one is insulted. Let it come up with a way out. It was not us who made this decision, it was them. So let them go back on it. That is it. However, they made the wrong decision, and now we have to look for a way out of the situation to correct their mistakes. They did it, so let them correct it themselves. We support this.
So I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what you're saying. I don't think that I am. I think you're saying you want a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine.
Right. And we made it. We prepared a huge document in Istanbul that was initialed by the head of the Ukrainian delegation. He affixed his signature to some of the provisions, not to all of it. He put his signature, and then he himself said, we were ready to sign it, and the war would have been over long ago.
Scripture says that the love of money is the root of all evil. That's why the war is continuing to roll on, thanks to Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and Joe Biden, well, of course, and other interested parties. And until common sense prevails, or change of government to the White House occurs, it'll just continue until, I guess, the last man or woman has been killed in the battlefield. Such a waste of life, such a terrible waste of life.
18 months ago. However, Prime Minister Johnson came, talked us out of it, and we missed that chance. Well, you missed it, you made a mistake, let them get back to that, that is all.
And of course Boris Johnson, also Roman Catholic, and I'd love to know exactly where the Jesuits are in all of this. I think I know pretty well. But you don't hear these people mentioned very often, do you, in interviews such as this? But they are very powerful. In fact, they predate Freemasonry by a couple of 100 years, and yet you hear so little about the Society of Jesus.
Why do we have to bother ourselves and correct somebody else's mistakes? I know one can say it is our mistake. It was us who intensified the situation and decided to put an end to the war that started in 2014 in Donbass, as I have already said, by means of weapons. Let me get back to furthering history. I already told you this. We were just discussing it. Let us go back to 1991, when we were promised that NATO would not expand, to 2008, when the doors to NATO opened to the declaration of state sovereignty of Ukraine, declaring Ukraine a neutral state.
There's no doubt that Russia have been surrounded by foreign fighters, foreign forces, and not many countries would be happy about that. So you can appreciate where he's coming from, and the British media never discussed this. And you've got British troops in Cyprus and other parts of the world have been there for decades, and nobody ever asked if they want foreign troops in their countries. We've got British troops in Germany. They've been there since 1944. Nobody asked the Germans if they want British troops in their country. The Americans have got 800 bases all over the world, 800 bases, and nobody asked those people if they want Americans in their country. It's a form of occupation. So I appreciate what Putin is saying, but again, I'm more interested in this from a spiritual perspective. Eternity. I mean, once you die, if you die a lost man or a lost woman, you go to hell forever. And what you've seen over the last couple of years is around 1 million fatalities. 1 million fatalities. An astronomical high amount of people just being killed left, right and centre. All because Putin, Zelensky couldn't do a deal. Zelensky apparently reneged on a deal going back to 2014. And the Bidens, the Obamas, who are very corrupt and have many business shares in Ukraine with Hunter Biden, have continued to push this war. And like I say, it won't end unless common sense prevails. Trump gets back in. Of course, Trump, he's got a score to settle with Israel. And Benjamin Netanyahu, very much struggling to win his PR war with the Hamas terrorists. And Zelensky supporting Hamas, incredible. And all these politicians fighting one another. They are waiting for the Antichrist to come, Mr. Fix-It.
Why are the Ukrainian authorities dismantling the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Because it brings together not only the territory, it brings together our souls. No one will be able to separate the soul.
Very poignant points, and he's probably right in saying that the Ukrainian church, or the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is very powerful and has been persecuted terribly in Ukraine over the last year or two. Zelensky has cracked down severely on that particular church, and if the church in Ukraine is able to unite with the church in Russia, and he could well be right, Putin. It could be a picture of unification in the not too far future. But no mention of Christ, second coming, 1,000-year reign, fixing up all these problems. It's all about, we got to do this, we got to do that, we are God, basically. They're all humanists, every single one of them.
Shall we end here, or is there anything else?
I think Tucker Carlson is somewhat in awe of Vladimir Putin, and he's probably outplayed him as well, according to some of the body language experts. But what you've seen is a crash course, really, in journalism and a political heavyweight. And I think my final thought would be that it will get a whole lot worse before it gets any better. And you owe it to yourselves to check everything that you've heard today, not just in my video but others around the world, to be sure that you know what you're being called to fight for and who you're going to be fighting, and what the reason for this particular war is all about. This is a picture of the Battle of Armageddon, and of course Ezekiel 38 and 39 speak about this in great detail. Of course, when those armies come together, they come from Turkey, Armenia and also Russia. So if you are a Bible-believing Christian, a prophecy follower, you're living in very fascinating times.